Good morning, everyone. My name is Akash Suri, and I'm the Public Affairs Officer at the U.S. Consulate General in Osaka, Kobe. Thank you all for joining us today. Today's program is brought to you in collaboration with our partners at World Learning and is entitled U.S.-Japan Alliance Projection in Pacific Island Countries, Countering PRC Influence. Our featured speaker today is Mr. Gregory Poling, Senior Fellow and Director of the Southeast Asia Program and Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative at CSIS. And our moderator for today is Dr. Saya Kiba at Kobe City University of Foreign Studies here in the Kansai region. Before we begin, a few administrative items as always. The session is on the record and is being recorded. The speaker and moderator are not employees of the U.S. government, so their remarks and expertise do not represent the official policy of the U.S. government. There will be English and Japanese simultaneous interpretation. Captioning for today's program is available in your web browser. Instructions can be found in the chat box. Following today's discussion, we will open up the session for questions and answers. We invite you to submit your questions throughout the session in the Q&A box. You can submit questions anonymously. With that, allow me to further introduce our speaker and moderator for today. Mr. Poling directs the Southeast Asia Program and Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, where he is also a senior fellow. He is a leading expert on South China Sea disputes and conducts research on U.S. alliances and partnerships, democratization and governance in Southeast Asia, and maritime security across the Indo-Pacific. He is the author of the recently published On Dangerous Ground, America's Century in the South China Sea, along with other works and articles on U.S. international relations. And again, today's moderator is Dr. Saya Kiba. Dr. Kiba is an associate professor of the Faculty of Foreign Studies, Department of International Relations, Kobe City University of Foreign Studies. Her major fields of interest are Southeast Asian studies, civil military relations, international cooperation policies, and defense diplomacy. She has experience as a practitioner, working at the Embassy of Japan in the Philippines and Embassy of Japan in Thailand. She also served as staff to Diet member Seiji Maehara from September 2010 to March 2012, when his Democratic Party of Japan was the ruling party. So with that, Mr. Poling, over to you.
Hi, Akash, thank you very much. It's a real honor to be asked to address the audience today, and I greatly appreciate, as always, collaboration with the embassy and with Kiba-san, who I've known for a while, and we've been able to work together before. I'd like to provide just a few minutes of opening remarks on the current state of U.S. and Japanese cooperation in the Pacific Islands, and why the issues received so much more importance over the last few years. I suspect that the audience is aware that, as with so much in the Indo-Pacific, much of current U.S. and Japanese attention was or is the result of Chinese inroads, economic and strategic. And this began arguably under the Obama administration in the United States, where almost overnight, Chinese loans and investment and diplomatic attention to the Pacific Islands skyrocketed from virtually nothing for most of the modern history of the People's Republic of China. Up to that point, the Pacific had largely been taken for granted by the US and I think by Japan and most of our allies as well. There had been a traditional division of labor. Australia and New Zealand had been the partners of choice for the South Pacific, meaning Melanesia and Polynesia. And the US, alongside Japan, had been the closest economic partners, and in the case of the US, security partners for the North Pacific, meaning Micronesia. And the sudden emergence of China as a major donor and diplomatic alternative overturned much of that. So we saw a degree of US attention during the Obama administration, including the first ever attendance by a US Secretary of State at the Pacific Islands Forum, but that was somewhat short-lived. And then we saw another resurgence of US interest during the Trump administration, but it was somewhat lopsided, and it was particularly hobbled by the fact that the Pacific Island countries have made very clear, including through their own Boe Declaration on regional security, that their number one security concerns are climate change and illegal fishing. And the US was not engaged on the climate change issue at that time. So it's really only been in the last 2.5 years of the Biden administration that increasing US concern about China has been matched by a more effective policy that's been welcomed by the Pacific Islands. And I think that is important, that we are engaging the Pacific Islands in the ways they want to be engaged. We saw last year in 2022, the first ever US Pacific Islands Special Summit in Washington, at which almost all of the Pacific Island leaders attended. The US at that time announced the intention to deliver over $800 million in new assistance to the Pacific over the coming years. We also saw last year the launch of the Partners in the Blue Pacific, in which the US and Japan partner with 6 of our other major donor countries, including Korea, Australia, New Zealand, and so on, to help deliver public goods, aid and investment, and so on in the Pacific Islands, heavily focused on climate change mitigation, on maritime security and illegal fishing, and on development priorities, including digital connectivity and so on. I also think it's important to note that this has coincided, this renewed attention from both US and Japan has coincided with a sudden decrease in Chinese economic influence. I mean, China has been good at capturing elites in individual countries, most spectacularly the Solomon Islands last year. But overall, Chinese investment and loans to the Pacific have really cratered, as they have in much of the region. Peak lending under the Belt and Road Initiative across the world happened in 2017, and that was also true in the Pacific. So if one looks at the best record of overall aid and development assistance to the Pacific Island countries, that is created by the Lowy Institute, based in Australia. The Lowy Institute finds that over the last 15 years or so, Australia is far and away the number one development partner for the Pacific Islands. Number 2 is China, followed by Japan, and then New Zealand and the US. But if we look at just the last couple of years, Japan has beaten China in the delivery of assistance to the Pacific Islands every year since 2018. And the US has beaten China every year since 2019. So we are on an upward trajectory and have a great deal of momentum that has to be continued, working not just with each other, but also with our Australian partners in particular. The one other thing I'd like to note, and then I'll stop here, is that the biggest, I think, danger for the US at the moment is that the US may delay the delivery of the funding that we have promised to conclude the renewal of the compacts of free association with the 3 countries of Micronesia. That would be Marshall Islands, Palau, and the Federated States of Micronesia. The US went through a very long, very tortured negotiation process with all 3 of those countries over the last couple of years. We finally signed renewals for 20 years of those compacts, which would essentially deny China any hope of military access to those countries for the next 20 years. And as part of the deal, we agreed to deliver more than $8 billion in assistance over those 20 years, the first $2 billion of which is being sought from the US Congress right now and has been caught up in our budget fights. So this is a major concern for the US that the administration is going to be working on very hard for the coming months. I think I'll conclude my opening remarks at that point. Thank you.
Mr. Poling, thank you very much for your presentation. So based on what you said, I would like to ask some questions. First of all, at the end of what you said, you referred to the compacts of free association, and also with Palau, there is an agreement. So specifically, what are they, and how is it important for the United States?
Thank you, Kiba-san. The compacts of free association are a very unique relationship that the US has with the three countries of Micronesia, that it has with no other country on earth. At the end of World War II, those three countries, alongside what is now the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands, were put under US trusteeship by the United Nations in what was called the Trust Territories of the Pacific. There were similar arrangements made for Papua New Guinea in the case of Australia, and for Niue and Tokelau in the Niue and the Cook Islands in the case of New Zealand. PNG, Papua New Guinea, is of course now independent, but Niue and the Cook Islands are in free association with New Zealand, and the three countries of Micronesia are in free association with the US. They have been, in the case of Marshall Islands and Micronesia, since the 1980s, and in the case of Palau since 1994. Those are the dates at which those countries gained formal independence. The Compacts of Free Association mean that they get very unique access to the United States. Their citizens are free to travel to the United States, to work, to study. They can serve in the armed forces of the United States, and they do at higher rates than the citizens of any US state. So essentially, they get to operate within the United States as if they were American citizens. The United States also provides them with things like the Postal Service. The US Postal Service takes care of their mail. The US took care of their vaccines. Palau was the first territory of the United States to reach kind of critical mass of vaccination during the pandemic. And the US provides billions of dollars over the last several decades for education, healthcare, and development assistance. In exchange for all that, the United States essentially has a veto over the ability of any foreign state to use the territory or the waters and airspace, including the EEZ, of those countries for military purposes. The US is also welcome to negotiate military agreements with those countries. So in the case of the Marshall Islands, we maintain a ballistic missile testing facility and a space launch facility. We are building new early warning radar in Palau, and there's negotiations with Micronesia for new US military basing as well. So this is a relatively cheap way for the US to make sure that China or any other potential adversary can never have military access to a huge swath of the North Pacific.
Thank you very much. So this compact of free association for the United States and also the long-term relationship that those countries have, I think for them it's very important. So about the policy of this, I think that there have been a lot of discussion about pros and cons for the compacts of the free association. Could you talk about that?
Yes, so the major concern on the US side, of course, comes down to money, as it always does. There is an immediate concern. We have a ballooning budget deficit in the United States, as so much of the developed world does in the wake of COVID. The immediate demand of the US Congress is about $2.5 billion over the coming year that they've tried to bake into the National Defense Authorization Act. This is the annual bill that funds the US Department of Defense. And congressional Republicans have said that they will not support that unless the administration can find an equivalent amount of savings somewhere else, $2 billion somewhere else. There's also the longer term concern. During the last negotiation, the last renewal of these agreements, which came during the George W. Bush administration, they had the way that the US delivered the financial assistance to these countries had been reworked into a trust fund model. So the US was supposed to put funding into these trust funds, which the countries would be able to draw from, but that would be self-sustaining. And particularly in the case of the Marshall Islands, it's recently come to light that those trust funds were horribly mismanaged, basically looted by successive governments, and that they are now broke and the money has simply evaporated. So that only worsens concerns in the US Congress that the money is not going where it's supposed to go.
Thank you very much. So now about the PIF. Recently, in the past several years, this Youth Pacific Island Forum, what were the outcomes and what kind of cooperation discussion being conducted in the past few years concerning PIF?
Yes, so the Pacific Islands Forum is the regional organization that brings together the 14 independent states of the Pacific, which includes Australia and New Zealand, as well as the 12 independent countries of Micronesia, Polynesia, and Melanesia. It also includes the various territories, New Caledonia, French Polynesia, and so on. And the US, along with Japan and China and several others, have been observers of the PIF for years now. And we have from time to time attended. What happened last year, similar to the US ASEAN Special Summit, is that was for the first time we had a leader level US Pacific Islands forum in which all of the independent states of the Pacific, along with representatives from most of the territories, came to Washington and had a face-to-face meeting with President Biden. That's never happened in the history of US engagement with the Pacific Islands. And then they had that again just this past September. I mentioned in my opening remarks, the headline was that last year, the US at that summit announced over $800 million in planned assistance. Now, of course, that is multi-year and they still have to seek it. They added another 200 million this year. And that's in addition to the more than 7 billion that's being negotiated just for the compacts of free association. The US also took a lot of symbolic, but I think important steps. Diplomatically, the United States announced that it would recognize the Cook Islands and Niue, which are, as I said, in free association with New Zealand, and so have the same legal status as our three freely associated states. But the U.S. has never formally recognized them as independent countries. We now do. The U.S. also announced that it would open new missions, new embassies across the region. The first of those was in the Solomon Islands, which the United States had closed in the 1990s. We've also opened a new embassy in Tonga and are opening another embassy in Vanuatu. And most of these, so the US has up until now only maintained embassies in Fiji, and all the rest of our ambassadors were based in other places, either New Zealand, Australia, or Fiji was responsible for the rest of the region. We're now engaging these countries on, I think, an equal footing, which is what, of course, everybody wants. And then you've seen, I think, a lot more multilateral cooperation, including through the new donor mechanism called the Partners of the Blue Pacific, which includes the US, Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand, the United Kingdom, and Canada. Apologies if I missed any. Where the donor nations have pledged to take the priorities that the Pacific Islands Forum itself laid out in its plan for a Blue Pacific 2050, which is its own, effectively its national security strategy, and to work together to fund those priorities, especially climate change and fisheries management, among other issues.
Thank you. You also mentioned that climate change is a major factor, a driver for PIF countries. And it's been acknowledged as that for some time. But which regions are specifically vulnerable to climate change, and how does the US plan to enhance its engagement? So the $800 million and $200 million, including illegal fishing or maritime security related issues, will it be evenly distributed across different agenda, or is it more focused on climate change with regard to the fund distribution you just touched upon?
I don't know that. So remember that the US administration has to negotiate with the Congress to get these funds actually authorized. So we don't know where each dollar will eventually go, but it's been made very clear that climate change, both mitigation and adaptation, will be a top priority. And that is absolutely vital to engaging the PIF countries. Several of the countries face a genuine threat to their existence, which, everybody on Earth is going to suffer the effects of climate change and severe weather. But Japan and the United States are not going to disappear. The Marshall Islands, Tuvalu, Kiribati, whole atolls, or even entire countries could well disappear without a substantial investment in climate change mitigation measures. And we've even seen the recent treaty signed by Australia and Tuvalu allows a special resettlement program for Tuvaluans who lose their islands to rising sea levels. You've had Tuvaluans, among others, buying land in places like Fiji to cultivate agriculture for years now because seawater inundation has made it impossible to grow crops. So for much of the Pacific Islands, especially the low-lying atolls of Polynesia and Micronesia, this is an existential threat, unlike anywhere else on Earth. And what we heard from the previous US administration, and I should say previous Australian administrations, was often talk about adaptation without being willing to talk about fundamental causes and decarbonization. And it was only in the last couple of years that we've had governments in both the US and Australia who are finally speaking to the Pacific Islands on climate change in the way that they want to be spoken to, and willing to put development dollars toward the programs that they really want.
Thank you. Specifically, I understand that climate change threat is fully recognized by these countries, but exactly what kind of projects are being desired by these countries, and what would be the most expensive project for Australia, for the US, and for Japan to work together? What do you think would be the areas and regions that needs most urgent attention?
Well, I suppose the most difficult and the most expensive project was the one that the Pacific leaders just laid out at the latest COP summit last week, which is a very rapid decarbonization of the global economy. They recognize that a certain amount of sea level rise and increase in severe weather events is now inevitable, but they are understandably not impressed by pledges to decarbonize by 2050 or later. They want to see the global north, the US, Japan, Europe, decarbonize faster. They also are joining much of the global south in demanding what's now often being called just energy transition. So a significant amount of funding from the global north to offset the additional cost of green energy in the global south, right? The assumption that we all developed our economies using coal and oil, and now we're demanding that nobody else be allowed to use coal and oil. Well, then we should pay them for foregoing those things. So that's the mitigation part, right? That is, they want us to step up and do the things we need to do to limit global warming and limit sea level rise as much as humanly possible. That is very difficult for all of us politically, and they are not getting, honestly, they prefer what they hear now to what they've been hearing for the last 10 years, but they're still not happy. And they're certainly not happy with the amount of funding being provided by donor countries through the various mechanisms set up at the COP summits. What they are getting, and what I think they will continue to get and certainly need, is funding for adaptation. More infrastructure investment, as these states, in many cases, literally sink under the waves. They are going to need potentially hundreds of millions of dollars in some cases to keep their homes above water, to keep major infrastructure above water, to keep infrastructure functioning. They're also going to need substantial assistance when it comes to agriculture and food security in the wake of seawater inundation and the loss of groundwater. They need substantial assistance for energy security. They've traditionally been reliant on diesel generators for outlying islands. Solar and wind is more sustainable, but also more expensive. And one other point I'll make, they also are many of the Pacific Islands have now joined with a few other small island developing states in the Indian Ocean and the Pacific, or in the Caribbean, in calling for a review of the legal regime surrounding the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea and the way it treats, or the way it does not treat, I should say, sea level rise. So under current international law, if the ocean rises and takes 100 miles of your coastline, you simply lose that coastline, and you lose 100 miles of your waters along with it. Your territorial baselines move inward. What the islands are demanding is that, if the Marshall Islands loses an entire set of islands in the next 20 years, it still wants to be able to maintain the traditional fishing grounds and resource rights that those islands generated. And that will require a negotiation of some kind of amendment or annex to the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea.
Thank you. These countries, working closely with other small island countries and close coverage, is something that they may be desiring. So that can be a possible scenario, work for these countries to work together. I have a question about undersea cables. This year, Japanese company NEC to Kiribati, Micronesia, and Gaul started a project laying the undersea cables in these countries. For PIF countries, what is the level of importance of these cables vis-a-vis the Chinese investment and engagement?
This is a critical issue, at least for the US and Japan and Australia. These are small island states with very small populations and very small economies. If they get an undersea cable, they will only get one. There's no way that anybody will make a profit by building two, which means if you are Palau, or if you are Tonga or Samoa, and a Chinese cable is built to your island, all of your internet traffic will always go through that Chinese cable, and China will be able to act as a gatekeeper. It's a degree of overdependence on China that I think the US and Japan rightly believe is unacceptable. It creates far too much leverage for China in these small island states. And so over the last 3 years in particular, we've seen a concerted effort by the US, Australia, and Japan to fund alternatives to Chinese undersea cable offers. That started with the undersea cable to Palau, which all three of us funded together. And we have been extremely successful. At the moment, there is no country in the Pacific, to my knowledge, that is dependent on a Chinese undersea cable. This is also vital because these economies, their best hope of development is digital services. They have traditionally relied on fisheries and marine tourism, and in a very few cases, resource extraction, which is now almost gone. If they want to develop and get over their aid dependency, they are extremely dependent on foreign aid. The best option they have are service-based economies on the internet. And these undersea cables, for the time being, are the best and really only options to deliver high-speed internet to these economies. Perhaps services like space-based internet will eventually make that a little easier, will eliminate that threat of Chinese monopoly. But for now, I think it's incumbent on Washington and Tokyo to make sure that no economy feels like China can simply turn off a switch and shut down all of their internet traffic.
Thank you very much. So optical cable say that it will be installed and the digital services in the Pacific Island becomes mainstream, for example, that will lead to the employment and the new economy and innovation starting. Is that the possibility?
It's the best hope they have. We have, as a donor community, spent untold hours in workshops and planning sessions to try to figure out how to assist Pacific economies to develop. And the problem that we always run into is that you cannot attract private sector investment outside of tourism and fishing because these are such tiny economies. You can't manufacture, there's not enough workforce. You can't sell because there's not enough of a consumer base. You can't get anything outside of the capitals because there's no infrastructure, right? If you're talking about Kiribati or the Marshalls, even Fiji, hundreds of outlying islands, some with only a few dozen people, there's simply no industrial base or resource base or consumer base to attract private sector development. But if everybody's on the internet, then they can take part in the global economy. They can be unshackled by the geographic constraints that they have faced.
Thank you very much. I see. So the private sector having interest in investing in this area, if we can realize that, that would be very, very important thing. Now, so far, we have not yet received any questions from the audience, but I would encourage you not to hesitate. You can ask questions either in Japanese or in English, and please use the Q&A box. So let me continue discussing with Mr. Poling. So let's turn to the military topic. So military engagement among the Pacific nations. There are nations, or many of them, do not have militaries. And until now, U.S. Military, together with the Pacific nations, they have done the joint exercises, military exercises. So for example, the Pacific Partnership is one example for the humanitarian support and the disaster recovery. Those were the major purposes. And the U.S. military, through those exercises, how are they planning to enhance the engagement with those countries? And what kind of cooperative, or in the area of the defense, what kind of cooperation would be desirable?
So, Kiba-san, you're right. Of all of the 12 island nations, independent island nations of the Pacific, only 3 have militaries: Papua New Guinea, Fiji, and Tonga. And Tonga is very, very tiny. So the US and Australia have been the traditional military partners of both Papua New Guinea and Fiji. Fiji, for instance, has a big peacekeeper training operation that has been heavily funded by Australia, supported by Australia. Its main training center, the Black Rock training camp, was upgraded with Australian funding. The US negotiated a new military access agreement early this year with Papua New Guinea, which will allow more high-end joint training. So we're doing a lot of the things in those two places that we do everywhere around the world, that we do with our partners, for instance, across Southeast Asia. How to engage the other countries who don't have militaries is an interesting dilemma. In the case of Micronesia, well, that takes place through the compacts. The corollary to the U.S. having exclusive military access to those countries is the U.S. has a legal obligation to defend them. The compacts of free association say that basically the U.S. military are their militaries. If Micronesia, in fact, we are treaty bound. If Micronesia, the Marshall Islands, or Palau were ever attacked, the U.S. has to treat that as if it were an attack on the U.S. homeland, which is an even stronger commitment than we make to any of our treaty allies, whether Japan, NATO, Korea, etc. So the U.S. has a huge interest in making sure that Micronesia is stable and secure. In the rest of the Pacific Islands, much of the U.S. engagement has focused on two things, military engagement, I mean. One, disaster relief. And this is not just a US issue. Of course, Japan is involved, Australia, New Zealand, France. In fact, long before we had a Quad in Asia, we had a Quad in the Pacific Islands, which is formally called the Pacific Quad. It's the US, Australia, New Zealand, and France, all of whom have reached an agreement for decades now to manage disaster relief operations in the Pacific Islands. So whenever a volcano, a typhoon, etc., strikes one of the Pacific Island states, depending on which one it is, one of those four countries is responsible for the immediate response. I believe, for instance, in the case of the devastating cyclone that struck Vanuatu a few years ago, it was the French who scrambled forces out of New Caledonia. The other area in which we've seen a lot of focus for the last 10 years has been on maritime security and maritime domain awareness. And this mirrors much of the US activity in Southeast Asia and South Asia. But we've seen the US has negotiated ship rider agreements with now every state in the Pacific Islands, meaning that essentially they are allowed to put their fisheries law enforcement aboard US Coast Guard cutters in order to engage in fisheries patrols, because they don't have ships of their own, so they get to use US ships. The US Navy has also every year sent Navy ships through the Pacific to conduct fisheries enforcement through a program called the Oceania Maritime Security Initiative. So anytime a US Navy ship is transiting from San Diego to Japan, it goes through the Pacific Islands, and if requested, will help arrest illegal fishermen. These are relatively cheap, but very effective and very visible U.S. commitments to public goods. And I should also flag that one of, if not the flagship right now of the Quad is the Quad's Indo-Pacific Partnership for Maritime Domain Awareness, in which the US, Australia, Japan, and India are collaborating to improve maritime domain awareness, particularly counter illegal fishing. And that includes the Pacific Islands, where the Australians are funding a new maritime fusion center that this data will be sent to, funded by the US and Japan.
Thank you very much. Japan has recently been interested in the degree to which Japan should be engaged in the areas of defense and security. In Southeast Asian countries, we have provided assistance in the area of capacity building over the last 10 years. SDF going to these countries providing training. Recently, Fiji and other Pacific countries are being engaged by Japan as well with similar activities. And OSA is a new Japan program to provide defense equipment free of charge to many countries. And that is the framework that has been newly launched. And Fiji is now designated as a priority country. Against this backdrop, Japan's defense engagement doesn't have a long track record, but from a U.S. experience, what kind of equipment should be provided in which manner? And what kind of capacity building should be provided by Japan? If you have any opinions, I would like to hear that.
So when it comes to providing military equipment, I think we have to divide the Pacific between Papua New Guinea and Fiji on one hand, who have militaries and have large populations relative to their neighbors, several million for Papua New Guinea, almost 1 million for Fiji, which in the Pacific is quite a lot versus everybody else. Providing traditional aircraft, patrol aircraft, crewed vessels, Navy or Coast Guard, training for Army, Navy, Air Force, peacekeeping operations, all of that makes a lot of sense in Fiji and Papua New Guinea. There's also a huge need for law enforcement cooperation in both those places. But in the rest of the Pacific, there's very limited capacity. Many of these places, they have enormous exclusive economic zones that they are responsible for. They sometimes jokingly refer to themselves not as small island states, but as large ocean states. And yet they've got very, very tiny law enforcement capabilities and no Navy, no Air Force capabilities. So we can provide them with patrol aircraft. We can provide them with a surface vessel, but if they don't have anybody to crew it, or if it's too expensive to maintain, then we haven't really helped. Traditionally, Australia and New Zealand have provided a lot of support on this front. They do regular fisheries patrols like the US does. I think seeing more Japanese involvement in that kind of effort, so we take the burden from them, could be helpful. Australia has also traditionally gifted the Pacific aircraft and especially ships through what it calls its Pacific Patrol Boat Program. But even the very small number of ships Australia gives, the Pacific Islands often have trouble maintaining. So I don't think Japan or the US providing Coast Guard cutters is going to be the answer if they only sit at the dock. One area where we can be, I would say 2 areas where we can be very, very helpful. One is in space-based sensing platforms. And this is a focus of the Indo-Pacific Partnership for Maritime Domain Awareness. The other that we haven't really explored yet in the Pacific Islands are uncrewed platforms, drones, both air and sea. We have seen the United States have a lot of success in the Middle East, in the Red Sea, where the US Fifth Fleet in Bahrain partners with Gulf states on unmanned surveillance of the Red Sea. We're experimenting with this now in Southeast Asia. I think Japan and the US, along with other donor nations, could work with Pacific nations to find the most efficient way to incorporate uncrewed platforms, aircraft and vessels into their maritime security frameworks so that they actually can monitor these huge expanses of ocean at a cost that doesn't bankrupt their governments.
Thank you. Exactly. Lots of equipment and technology needs to be combined so that cost effectiveness can be maximized operationally. Thank you. In terms of law enforcement, you mentioned that they have a very low law enforcement capacity. Is it because their EEZ is being too vast with insufficient assistance in the areas of talent? or is it more related to the lack of governance? And how can we approach to the issues related to the governance problems?
It is both. For decades now, the Pacific Island states have been given huge responsibility through these regional organizations like the Western Pacific Fisheries Commission and the PNA, the Parties to the Narrow Agreement, as it's called. They are responsible for policing illegal fishing across the entire Pacific, even areas outside of their own exclusive economic zones, which they do not have the capacity to do. Even the US and Japan historically would be hard pressed to do that. And so there was never much attempt. They monitored and enforced fisheries law just offshore, and they set up mechanisms to license and collect fees from foreign vessels, US, Japanese, Korean, etc., that chose to register. But those that chose not to, those that illegally fished, especially Chinese, but also others, Taiwan, for instance, had a large illegal fishing presence in the Pacific, they were left to their own devices because there was no hope of monitoring or catching them. That's only begun to change in the last few years. And it's largely because of the rise of space-based technologies. It has become possible since about 2008 to begin tracking vessels from space. And that's it. It's only been 15 years. And in that 15 years, now you or I can hop on Global Fishing Watch, powered by Google, and find almost every ship on the planet. So the technological problems are being solved. There are still other problems, and if boats really want to hide, they'll find ways to hide. But the technology and the cost are becoming less of an issue. Now the governance structures need to catch up. One of the major solutions here is what's called the PSMA, the Port State Measures Agreement, which is an international treaty signed by both Japan and the US, along with dozens of other states, that says essentially it lays out the responsibilities of any country who receives a fishing ship. So if you are a fishing vessel and you catch fish in the exclusive economic zone of, say, Vanuatu, and then you go and offload it in Japan or offload it in the US, it's the responsibility of Japan or the US to check your catch and confirm that you caught it where you said you caught it and in the amounts that you say you caught it. If we actually can get global enforcement of PSMA, that also takes a lot of the burden off the Pacific states, right? Because it's very, very hard, almost impossible, to monitor all the fishing boats in the world when they're at sea. But they all have to come to port eventually, right? That's the smart place to do the enforcement, not out at sea. And if you can enforce fisheries law at port, then that means that you can use your law enforcement for the things that are really important, like smugglers and narcotics and piracy. You don't have to waste your time chasing illegal fishermen all over the ocean.
Thank you. We have some questions from the audience. Next year, there is a US presidential election. There may or may not be change in the government, but what impact would the result of election have on the US-Japan relations?
I don't have a crystal ball, and I think I'm notoriously bad at predicting the future. I'll say this: after the last elections, after the 2016 elections, of course, the US approach to partners and allies changed radically, and in ways that made many of our allies and partners extremely uncomfortable. Nobody handled it better than Japan. And the Abe government was able to forge a working relationship with the Trump administration, and not only do that, but manage to save other US alliances in the process, right? Convincing the Trump administration that Korea, the Philippines, even European partnerships were important. So I have a high degree of confidence that given the history, given how much experience Japanese leadership has managing both Republican and Democratic administrations in the US, that Japan will be able to maintain a healthy alliance with any US government, and may well have to step up, as it did under the previous administration in the US, fill some of the gap that was left by US disengagement in certain areas.
Thank you. So not just watching what would happen in the election, Japan, we ourselves have to think about it. So maybe the last question that we received is about China and the power behind China. Sorry, the factors behind China's power. What are the reasons? For example, economic power, population, history, military power. There are different factors. So behind the strength of China, what are the major factors and how will it change?
That's a very big question. I think it's maybe easiest to answer it by saying, how has China used its power in the region? And unlike the United States and unlike Japan, China's influence in the Pacific Islands and in Southeast Asia and South Asia has been almost entirely economic. It has almost no military partnerships beyond occasional ship visits. Its only real ally is North Korea. Its only real military friends are Russia and Pakistan. It does very limited defense engagements, so it can't match the strategic partnerships that the US or Japan now or Australia maintain. It also has very little cultural cachet outside of its own sphere. Everybody in the Pacific listens to Radio New Zealand and the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, and they tune into US television. Nobody's watching CCTV. Nobody's lining up at Chinese consulates in the region to apply to move to China and become Chinese citizens. That doesn't happen. They're not seeking entry into Chinese universities. So China's influence boiled down to money, and particularly under the Belt and Road Initiative, and even before Belt and Road was formally launched. So we can probably tag this to maybe 2012 or 2013. Now the money's gone, or at least the easy money's gone. The money has decreased. As I said in my opening remarks, the Belt and Road Initiative really peaked in 2017. And that's true in the Pacific Islands, just like it is everywhere else in the global South. China is still a major economic player, but it's just one of many, right? It is no longer driving economic growth in the region. It's competing with the US, Australia, Japan, and the multilateral banks. And as a result, I think we've seen China's influence in the region severely diminished. Once it was no longer the economic juggernaut that it was for only a few brief years, it lost much of its influence overnight. And the only places that it right now is having lasting success are in places where China is able to capture a relatively small number of elites, usually small corrupt elites, who use Chinese money for their own purposes. Think the Solomon Islands or Cambodia, the previous administration in Sri Lanka, and that's not sustainable. China is not forging deep society-wide bonds in these countries. It's merely capturing elites of the day who will eventually leave office.
Thank you so much for that discussion. I can't believe an hour went by so quickly, but thank you for the engaging conversation. Before we end the program today, we'd like to invite our audience to take our short event survey. You'll see a QR code pop up on your screen now. Please scan the QR code or access the link in the chat box. While everyone takes a moment to answer the survey, I'd like to again thank our speaker, Dr. Poling, for joining us today and for sharing his expertise. And thank you, of course, very much to Dr. Kiba for your contributions and for facilitating the discussion. And a special thank you to our simultaneous interpreters and technicians at NHK and our captioners. Finally, I'd like to invite the audience to visit our website and our social media for further information on upcoming events and programs. We hope to see you again soon. Thank you all and have a good day or evening wherever you might be.